We are continuing our study in the book of Acts. We're now in Acts 27. Closing in on the end of the book of Acts, Paul has been grabbed and taken by force in the city of Jerusalem, then taken to Caesarea for a trial, a sham trial. We saw in the previous couple of chapters that the governorship of the province had changed from Felix to Festus. Paul then made his case before Festus and King Agrippa. Paul appealed to Caesar. Paul was taken to Rome, and here we see Paul put on a ship to go to Rome. We have this very fascinating nautical tale that Luke records for us in the book of Acts. The most detailed account of the shipwreck in the ancient world, and an account that historians appreciate for its value, its accuracy, and the description of the trials that went on in this shipwreck, and the vivid emotions that are brought out in this. So we just start here in verse 1. And it was determined that we should sail unto Italy. They delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustine's band. And so Paul was put on a ship in charge of this centurion. And this centurion wasn't just any centurion. This was one of the Augustine band. That means of the imperial regiment. It means he was a highly skilled leader, in control of 100 men, 100 soldiers. And this would have been a person who would have come up through the ranks. Wouldn't have been more likely a nobleman's son, but it would have somebody who came up from the ranks to assume command of these 100 men. So this Julius was put in charge of the prisoners. And notice that there was more than one prisoner. Paul was one of several prisoners. It doesn't say how many. It could have been as many as 100 prisoners. We don't know how many prisoners were going on this trip. And so if we look here, I have a picture of the coast of Caesarea. So this would have been the port where they would have left. They would have boarded ship here. And the ship that they boarded was a small coastal vessel. We can see in verse 2, and entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia. And here are Paul's traveling companions. One, Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And so Paul and Luke and Aristarchus, at least those three, were on board this ship to make the journey to Rome. So Luke and Aristarchus weren't prisoners, but being friends of Paul's, they wanted to join him on this journey. Now this Aristarchus is mentioned in several places in Scripture, but one place in particular is in the book of Colossians. So Colossians was written with one of the first prison epistles. And at the end of the book of Colossians, Paul writes this: Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, saluteth you. So apparently, Aristarchus stayed with Paul through all of these trials and tribulations going on this journey to Rome, and went to prison with Paul. So his fellow prisoner Aristarchus and Marcus, sister son to Barnabas, so this is Barnabas' nephew, were in prison at Rome with Paul. And Paul just informs the Colossians, touching whom if you receive commandments, if he come unto you, receive him. Verse 3, and the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. So the next day they touched base from Caesarea. They moved to the port of Sidon, which would have been about 67 miles, a one-day cruise in these coastal cruisers. To get up there, 24 hours to travel up to the port of Sidon. And very notably, Julius, the centurion, courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends in the city of Sidon to refresh himself. Now you remember a few weeks or months ago when we were discussing the end of Paul's missionary journey. Paul spent a good amount of time in Tyre, which was very close to Sidon. Paul spent 7 days there. Paul spent a week in Tyre visiting friends. So he had friends who would help him on his journey. Because one of the things about being a Roman prisoner was that the state did not feed you. They didn't give you food, shelter, and clothing. You had to provide that for yourself. In fact, it's even worse than that. You had to pay for your own chains. You had to pay for the soldier who was guarding you. So being a Roman prisoner was no small affair. Not only that, we're going to see in a little bit that they were late into the season. They were into the fall of the season. And they would have had to provide their own shelter, their own clothes being out on the open sea. So it was very important that Paul get to his friend's house, Paul and his company, where they could get provisions for this journey and make ready to go. So this was a great liberty. This was a very courteous thing that Julius did to help Paul in this situation. Verse 4. And when we had launched from there, we sailed under, that is, in the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. So if we look here at a map of the situation, we can see that Paul and company left Caesarea, sailed one day here to Sidon, and then the wind was blowing, apparently from the south, from the southwest, and pushed them around behind into the lee of the island of Cyprus. They would normally, to get to Myra, travel with Cyprus to their right, but because of the contrary winds, they had to keep Cyprus on their left and stay out in a shelter from this wind. And so you can see the situation was already very turbulent on the open sea because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. So here they're sailing under the Pamphylia and Sicilia into this city of Myra. And this city of Myra was a prominent city who had one inhabitant, the bishop of Myra. You would recognize as St. Nicholas, who we'll talk about in future weeks. But St. Nicholas was from the city of Myra. Verse 6, and there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us thereon. So this ship of Alexandria, so this would have been a grain ship, a cargo ship. And I have a couple of pictures. We might see what this cargo ship looks like. So this is a cutaway of the cargo ship. The cargo ship would have these decks and a large hold area to hold these vessels. These vessels, the name of them slips in my mind at the moment. But these clay vessels, these large clay jars, were designed in such a way that they could be strapped in layers to make the most advantageous use of the space in the cargo hold. So these would have been filled with wheat. There's another picture of this ship. This is a 1/100 scale model of this grain ship. Here's another picture of a model they have at a museum in Turkey, a 1/10th model, the size of the thing. So this ship would be roughly 180 feet long. It would be perhaps 40 feet wide. So this was quite a ship with a displacement of maybe 2,000 tons or so. It was quite a large ship. In fact, after the ancient age, during the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, no ships approached this size until the 19th century, before they started having sailing ships that were this large again. So this really speaks to the development of the shipping area in the Roman era. Here is a picture, if you can see this, a picture of the anchor crossbar. It's 14 feet long, made of lead, that they would use on a ship such as this. So this is a huge, huge anchor. 14-foot long lead bar. So the grain was raised in Egypt. Rome had more people than they could feed, and so they needed to depend on these grain ships from Egypt to satisfy the people's need for food. Moving on to verse 7. And when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Sidon, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete against Salome. So look at this. They were late in the season, and they had to go very slow. So these ships had one big sail, and they couldn't tack. They couldn't tack into the wind and sail into the wind. At this stage, they depended on the wind being behind them to push the ship along. And so it was very slow going as they were trying to sail into the wind. The wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salome. So let's look at a picture of what they were doing here. So they tried to make it to this Sindus. They were prevented from doing so by the wind, and so they had to turn south and come under Crete. So the wind would have been blowing from the north or from the west, pushing them, and they barely made it under this island of Crete. Let's take a little bit, another look at this. This is the island of Crete. And so they came here from the right-hand side. They sailed under Crete to avoid these winds that were pushing upon them. And they barely made it, if you look at the text. And hardly passing it, verse 8, came into a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh unto the city of Lycia. So Fair Havens is here on this little point. This little jetty is the harbor of Fair Havens on the island of Crete. And they were happy to make it there. With the winds pushing them, they barely made it. And I have a couple of pictures of Fair Haven as well. So here is the port of Fair Haven from the south, looking towards the north at the port. And you can see this port's not very large. Not large enough for a ship that's almost 200 feet long to be ported here for the winter to be subject to all of the storms blowing in. If you look at this from the north looking south, you see this view. You see they just had this small island. Of course, at the time it didn't have these big reservoir tanks on it, but this was all they had protecting them from the violent winds coming off the Mediterranean. So they were in the port of Fair Havens. Continuing in verse 9. Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. So the fast he talks about here is the fast of Yom Kippur, which happens in the beginning of October. So we know that it was late on in the season to be sailing. It would have been about this time of year. And Paul is reminding them, verse 10, Paul admonished them and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and with much damage, not only of the lading in the ship, but also of our lives. So remember, Paul is a seasoned traveler. In 2 Corinthians, he describes some of his adventures. Of the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes minus 1. He says 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. And then come these words. 3 times I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I have been in the deep. In journeys often in peril of water, in peril of robbers, in peril by my own countrymen, in perils by the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, and perils among false brethren. So Paul, being an experienced traveler and experienced on these ships, reminded or admonished the leaders not to leave the port, to stay in Fair Havens. We come to this verse 11. Nevertheless, so in spite of Paul's voice of experience, admonishing them to stay in port, nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things spoken by Paul. Now, this makes us wonder, why in the world would they be so eager to leave fair havens? Why would they be so eager to get back out on the sea? This is because Rome needed the grain. So this was a grain ship, and we see that there were some famines in the land. There had been famines. Luke talks about a famine in chapter 8, when Agnes stood up, one of them named Agnes, stood up and signified by the Spirit that there should be a great famine throughout all the world, which came to pass, look, in the days of Claudius Caesar. So this had happened some 20 or so years earlier, that this famine had come on the land. And in fact, during the reign of Claudius, there were two famines that befell the empire. And because of these famines, because of these past famines that had happened years earlier, Claudius was very active in seeking to prevent this from happening again. And in the biography of Claudius, Suetonius writes this biography of Claudius, and he says, when there was a scarcity of grain because of a long continued drought, Claudius was once stopped in the middle of the forum by a mob, and so pelted with abuse, and at the same time with pieces of bread, that he was barely able to make his escape to the palace by a back door. And after this experience, he resorted to every possible means to bring grain to Rome, even in the winter. To the merchants he held out the certainty of profits, listen, by assuming the expense of any loss that they might suffer from the storm, and offered to those who would build merchant ships large bounties. So here we see that the throne was, in a sense, backing the ship. And it encouraged these merchants to take risks that they wouldn't normally take to try to get this cargo to Rome. So continuing on in verse 12, and because the haven, that is fair haven, was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenix, and there to winter, which is a haven of Crete, and lies towards the southwest and northwest. So the pilots and the ship captains knew that there was a better port just a few miles, maybe 50 miles away. There was a much better port to winter in. This Fair Havens port was exposed. They would have had to leave the grain on the ship all winter. There wouldn't have been a granary there to offload this ship, exposing the granary to possible damage by seawater soaking into the ship and causing the grain to expand and possibly splitting the ship and damaging the ship. For different reasons, they didn't want to winter over in Fair Haven. It was not commodious. Perhaps there wasn't room to safely hold the prisoners under charge of the centurion. For whatever reason, they decided that they wanted to try to make this run across to the port of Phoenix. Now, let me just take a picture of this situation. So here they are in Fair Haven. If you can see this at the very bottom of the island here. And the port of Phoenix, about 50 miles away, is to the north and west of Fair Haven. And to get there, they would have to sail across this dangerous stretch of land, this 12-mile stretch of land that would expose them to any violent winds coming from the north. Once they got back into behind the mountains, they would be safe again. But the trick was how to get across this open span. And I think I have a picture of that here as well. Yes. 12 miles from the port of Fair Haven across this valley basin before they would be secured behind the western mountains of the island. So that was their aim in trying to make it to the port of Phoenix. So let's see what happens. Verse 13. And when the south wind blew softly. Supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. So let's go back to our map. So the winds would have been coming from the bottom of the screen from the south, and that was perfect. That was the direction they wanted to go. The wind would push them 12 miles across this valley bottom behind the mountains where they would be safe from this violent northeast winds that would potentially blow down from across the island and push them off course. So that was their plan. They thought that they had made it. The winds were blowing softly, and they had obtained their purpose. And verse 14 begins with this word, but. A ominous start. But not long after, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called a Euroclydon. So this wind would blowing down. This would have been what we call today a nor'easter. This tempestuous, when it says tempestuous wind, the idea here is it's the same word behind the word typhoon. Typhoon was the most violent of the Greek gods. In fact, I think I have a picture of the representation here. Yeah, typhoon. This image of a Greek god is very large, with serpent-like appendages. Was the typhoon god, and that was the namesake of this great wind, this tempestuous wind called a Euroclydon. So this violent wind didn't drive them in a circular motion, but it drove them, we will see in the next week, 600 miles across the open ocean. So it was a very violent wind that what we would today call a nor'easter. In verse 15, and when the ship was caught and could not bear up in the wind, we lit her dry. So they were caught in this wind, couldn't get out, and they had to let it go. There was nothing that they could do. And running under a certain island, which is called Claudia, we had much work to come by the boat. So if we go back to our picture, we see here the island of Claudia, this little island down here to the southern part of Crete. The violent wind blew them down past this island out into the open sea, and they were put in much jeopardy because of this violent wind, and had much work to come by the boat. That's to secure the boat, their lifeboat, as it were. They had trouble even managing that in the wind. And that is where we're going to stop today. Lord willing, we'll pick up again next week.